Hello and welcome to BlenderTutor.com. My name is Tom Latvies, and this is the second tutorial in the Blender Bootcamp series. In this tutorial, we're going to go over the navigation basics in Blender. So let's get started. So when you first open up Blender, you're going to start with this basic scene, and if you've never really worked in Blender or a 3D program before, you're going to not really know where to start. So before we get into creating objects, let's just talk about navigating the 3D viewport in general. So to rotate around your object, or your selected object anyway, just hold down your middle mouse button and drag, and you'll be able to rotate it in any direction you want. If you want to zoom in and out on your object, it's very easy. Just scroll up and down on your middle mouse button, and say you want to shift the scene around, like move the virtual camera to decide which way you're looking at the scene. You just hold down shift and then your middle mouse button, and it'll let you move around the scene like that. So if you want to get a better view of something. And another way you could get around the scene are your keyboard shortcuts, which I highly recommend memorizing and using, because it's gonna once you start using keyboard shortcuts, you're gonna speed up your work by a lot. So if you have a number pad, if you hit 1, it'll be the front view. If you hit 3, it'll be a side view, and if you hit 7, you're gonna look at your scene from the top view. And then if you hold down Control, so if you hold 1, it's front. Control and 1 is going to be back. So basically Control plus the number will be the opposite. 3 will be the one side, Control 3 is the other side, and then 7 is the top. Control 7 is going to be bottom view. So try to remember those, and you'll be moving faster in no time. So now let's talk about moving objects around in the 3D view. So we have this cube here, and you see this green, red, and blue arrows. These are your manipulators, I guess, and you're gonna basically just click on them to move them in the direction that the arrow is pointing. So if I hit this green one, I'm gonna move along the y-axis. Blue will be up and down on the z, and then the red will be the x. And then if you want to rotate, if you click on this curve right here, it'll bring up this little ball, and once again you can just rotate along the y, x, z, and then if you see this little white circle in the center, you could actually free rotate it. So if you click in there, it'll just let you rotate in any direction you want. And then last, you'll have this little line with a square at the end, and that's actually going to let you scale in different directions. So once again, you can scale on X, scale along the Y, and then scaling along the Z. Now, to me, I actually never use these, because to me they just feel slow and kind of pointless. You could actually even turn them off if you don't use them. I usually keep it on just for reference of which way the scene is, where the X and Y axis are, but aside from that, I use keyboard shortcuts to do all my manipulation of my 3D objects. And I would recommend, once again, learning your keyboard shortcuts, because it's going to just speed up your work so much and make it easier for everyone. So Blender actually has really easy to remember keyboard shortcuts. If you want to move your object or grab your object, you click G, and you could just free move it around just by clicking G once, and then just moving your cursor, and it's going to follow your cursor. And say if you want to move it just along the x-axis, you'll hit G, X, and it'll lock it into just the x-axis. And it's going to do that for all of them, so GY, GZ. And same goes for scaling. If I want to scale, I could do just hit S and it'll scale everything, or I could choose which axis I'm going to scale along. So that is nice. And once again, rotate will be R. So just free rotate, RX, RY, RZ. And then actually if you hit R twice, it's going to let you do that free rotate maneuver again, which is nice and helpful. So yeah, that is just the basic manipulation of objects in general. Now say I've messed this object up and I don't want it anymore, I want to get rid of it. You can actually just hit X and delete, and it'll get rid of it for you. And then if you hit Shift A, it'll bring up this little menu here that'll let you basically create all the basic objects that you can inside of Blender. So for now we'll just start with mesh objects. We'll create a cube, just what you start with. And we'll have that now. Okay, so now that we have our cube, let's talk about maybe manipulating it in another way. What we're in right now is something called object mode. That's just where you can't really manipulate the vertices of your object. You can just change it in broad strokes like scale, rotation, and position. Say we want to change its shape or something. Well, to do that, we're going to have to go into edit mode, which actually lets you move the individual vertices or edges or the faces. So to get into edit mode in general, you'll just hit tab, and by default it's going to bring you into the vertex mode, in which you could literally just click on any vertex you want. To select a vertex, I'm just right clicking on one, and that goes for objects in your scene as well. If you want to select something, you're going to right click on it, or you could hit A to select all, or A again to deselect everything. So with my cube selected, go into edit mode, we could, you know, easily change its shape. I will select a couple of these and move those down here. And actually, the camera right now is in perspective view, which you can see as the lines go away, they're all going in the same direction. It's basically a more realistic view, how we see the world. But to do things more accurately, especially with you know, harsh objects like a cube or something, you can go into orthographic view by hitting 5 on your numpad, which basically just flattens everything. It's actually, it looks basically like those old computer games, like the old Fallout games and everything, where as things get farther away from the camera, they don't actually get smaller. They're always the same size. So that's helpful for some things, especially for like maybe architectural purposes, or, you know, building a room or furniture or something. But you know, it has its place, and in this instance I'd like to use it to grab these vertices and just change the shape of this cube. Now I can't see through the cube, so what I can do is actually hit Z on my keyboard, and it's going to make it basically see-through. It's basically a wireframe view of the cube. If I hit Z again, it's going to bring me into the solid view. So yeah, and you saw me switching before between vertex and edge view and face view. How I did that was if I hit Control Tab, it'll bring up this little menu, so I can go to edges and I can select full edges instead of having to select the 2 vertices. Or if I do it again, Control Tab, I go to faces, and I could select the individual faces on my cube. So that could speed things up if you're trying to get a specific shape going. Okay, so now that I've gone over edit mode, I'd like to go over the different layers in your 3D view. If I right now you start by default on layer 1. If I were to click on the second one, like all these boxes right here are your layers. These top ones are all in a row, and then goes down here. It goes up to 20 layers. So if I were to click on the second layer, I have nothing on it, so there's nothing there. And you could actually quickly jump back and forth between layers with your top number bar on your main keyboard. So basically each number is one of the layers. So 1 is layer 1, 2 is layer 2, 3 and 4, and you can see it changing down here as I'm jumping back and forth. And with a scene as simple as this, it's not, you know, really necessary. But if I had a full scene where I had all kinds of different objects in there and I wanted to keep them separate for organization purposes, that's the reason you'd use separate layers. Or once you get further along into a complex scene and you want to composite things, you're going to need to actually move things to different layers so that later in compositing you can add them separately. So if you want to say move, if I'm trying to just get work done right now, I can move my camera and my light to layer 2 just by hitting selecting them, just right clicking on them. If I hold shift and right click, I could select multiple objects. So I'll select my camera and my light. I hit M on my keyboard and then I select the layer that I want. So I want layer 2, and now it's gone. So now I can jump back and forth between those two, and everything's exactly where it was position wise. It's just on a separate layer. And I could even, if I hold down shift and click on these, I could have them both united again. So just keep that in mind, play around with layers, and they do become very helpful, especially once you get more complex scenes done. So now that we've gone over layers, I just want to go over one more thing. There's a few side tabs that can be actually very helpful for us. This one, the Object Tools tab, is actually already open, I believe by default. There's another one on this side that's closed right now. If I hit N, it's going to open this one. It's going to show me a whole bunch more information that could be useful to me. So this one on the left, the Object Tools, if I hit T on my keyboard, it'll compress it, or T again, it'll bring it back open. Same with this one on the right, N to open and close it. So say I just want a whole bunch of work on my screen just to model. I could close both of those and have a maximum view. But if I wanted to use some of those, I could just open those up. And so in this side, it's kind of got some redundant tools that I've already used in different, you know, scenarios already, like with my manipulators down here. But I could translate, which is, I believe, is just move position. I could rotate and scale, which, you know, I actually never would use any of these buttons, but some of these are going to be useful. I have like how my object is shaded. I can, right now it's flat, so you can see actually the harsh lines. But if I were to go to smooth, it's going to look more like a, you know, it was much softer angles, which for this it actually looks pretty weird. You wouldn't use that on something as harsh as this object, but let's say I had a sphere, so I go UV sphere, move that up, and if I turn on smooth shading now I have a, you know, pretty round ball that looks a lot better than this harsh jagged ball that's by default created. Aside from that, we have a whole bunch of other tools that we'll get into later. I just wanted you to be aware that this toolbar is there and you can get rid of it if you need to. And then on this right side, once again, you're going to have some transform options. It's going to actually tell you exactly the numbers of your object. So if I did scale this to like an egg or something, you can now see that it actually shows me the numbers, and I can manipulate that just by typing in numbers instead of having to do it with the manipulators. Or I could very easily bring it back to its default, you know, positions. Same with this, so I could go 0, 0, 0, and yeah. Aside from that, we have our some camera options. Our item, what our item is, or our object is actually called. So right now, it's by default just going to be named whatever the primitive shape is. So obviously this is a cube, this is a sphere. You can name that to whatever it actually is. I have my screencast keys on so you can see what I'm doing down here. It just basically shows a bunch of information that you may or may not use. This one right here is actually going to be pretty useful, the background images. I will actually go over that later. So yeah, now that we're done going over that sidebar, let's close that, get that out of here. And I'm going to go over just this properties panel over on the right side. So you can actually move any of these different windows over just by clicking on it. Wait till your cursor changes that little double arrow and you can move it over like that. So right over here we have all these different buttons that'll show you different settings of your world, your 3D world. Right now it's going to by default start on the render settings, so basically size, size of your image, aspect ratio, where it will be saving it, and then rendering options that we'll get into in another tutorial. Okay, so after render you have your scene settings, you have your world settings, object settings, so in this sense it's going to just be whatever your object is selected, constraints for your object, which we'll get into in another tutorial, modifiers as well we'll get into, object data, materials, textures, particle systems, which that'll be in a more advanced tutorial, and even physics. So there's a whole lot going on here that we'll get into, but just want you to start being aware of all the different options that are really hiding in plain sight. You wouldn't really know that they're there until you start looking around for them. Down here we have our timeline, which is really more used for animation, or if you have animated objects that you want to render an image with and you need motion blur or something. That's what we're going to use this for. We're going to go over this in a later tutorial on animation. So I'll skip over that for now, but just keep in mind that that's there as well in your default view. And actually really I'd like to go over these different views right now. When you first open your Blender file, you're going to start in this default view, but there are a whole bunch of different views that you'll use for different specific purposes. So you have an animation view, you have a compositing view, default, game logic, scripting. There's a whole bunch of different views that you'll use. Some I probably didn't even start using different layouts until the first 6 months of using Blender, because I was just trying to learn the basics of the 3D view. So don't feel rushed into getting into everything, but just keep in mind there's a lot of different things here for you, and it's all very useful. And you could actually even create your own view if you wanted to. We'll go over that in a little later tutorial because that's a little much for now, but just keep in mind there's a lot of customization you could do to your scene and to your blend files that it's just really quick and easy and useful. So there's a lot Blender has set up for you to make things easier for you. So we see all these different views, and they all have a little box in the little menu line here that you could actually open, and you could switch it to any view. So even though this is the default 3D view, if I wanted to, I could go and switch this over to the UV image editor, which you'll use for texturing, or even just reference photos that you could pull up. I can switch it over to my node editor if I want to set up some materials or start compositing. You can change it to any of them, but you won't necessarily always need one that's going to fill up the entire screen. But just keep in mind that's there as well. It is pretty useful. And you could actually even multiply your screen view like this just by going up in the top corner or even the bottom left corner and dragging it over. And it's a simple way to, you know, either get different views of your scene really easily, or you can have one that's set up as the UV image editor. You're gonna have one of your perspective and one of the node editor for materials or something. That's a pretty common layout that you'll be using once you're setting up your scene. And then if you wanted to join these back together, you can just right click on the line when your cursor changes back to this. You go to join and even select which one's going to join. So I want to keep the 3D view, so I'll go over here, do it again, move it like that. And you could also do it horizontally or vertically, not just horizontally. And you could really just keep on dividing these. It's pretty crazy how insane you can make your layout. And it gets a little overwhelming at a certain point, but it's nice to have the option at least. Okay, so that's a pretty good start to navigating the general Blender interface. We're gonna get into some more advanced settings, over rendering things in later tutorials, but for now I'll call that a tutorial. Thanks for watching, and the next tutorial is going to be modeling basics. Thanks.